Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to continue our look at the late 1800s with the topic of urbanization, or people moving into the cities. Learning targets, we'll talk about urban growth in the late 1800s, explain how technology helps to improve city life with all these people moving there, and we'll talk about the problems caused by rapid urban growth and the ways that we try to solve them with more organization. So in the late 1800s, people start moving from the rural farm areas of the country into urban cities, and also immigrants start to settle in cities. And so this process of people starting to live in cities more than the rural areas of the country is known as urbanization. And there's a couple different causes. One, we already mentioned the immigrants moving there because of the need for unskilled labor in factories. Also, the rural to urban migrants, or what we call farmers, that either lost their jobs, were put out of business by mechanization of farms, couldn't make enough money with the crops they were growing. For whatever reason, they moved to the city for newer and better variety of jobs other than farming, which was also a pull factor to the cities. Here's a graph. You can see 1860 through 1920. Finally, in 1920, more of our country's population lives in cities than in rural areas. But you can see the process of creeping up. It's a trend growing through the latter half of the 1800s. So immigrants and farmers, immigrants basically have to live close to work because they can't afford any sort of transportation besides walking to their job. Some immigrants also move to the cities to join their families that have already been living there. Others move there because they're recruited by large companies who need labor, and they basically recruit immigrants right off the street. Using this type of means and recruiting in certain places, entire industries start to become made up of different types of immigrants from different places. Rural to urban migrants might move there because lower prices and unpredictable weather and rural conditions force people to make it in the city with a new job at a factory. Factories indoors, it's year-round. There's not a harvest season or a growing season, so year-round you can make money, and you usually got cash on the spot, which was rare in rural areas. But most farmers found the transition to factory work difficult. Otherwise, other than that, basically Midwestern cities explode for this reason. Chicago and Minneapolis become huge cities during 1880 and 1890. The cities offer different sorts of advantages. It improves a person's standard of living. We have a growing middle class with access to different types of entertainment and different luxuries with this new money that they have that maybe they wouldn't have anywhere else. They are able to send their children to school and to college in the city. There's new entertainment options, different theaters, clubs. We'll get into that stuff in our next session. Different museums for education in the cities, and a wider variety of jobs. Women had more access to jobs in the city. So in addition to being able to work in a factory as maybe a seamstress, they can work as independent sewers, maids, teachers, secretaries. There's a lot more opportunity for women in the city. New technology in the city makes life easier. We start to develop building codes, and a code is just like a law, but it helps keep cities less crowded together if we have standard ways that buildings have to be created. Skyscrapers are starting to be built using this new, stronger Bessemer steel, and this wouldn't be possible if people had to walk all the way to the top. So Elisha Otis develops the safety elevator, which won't plummet to the bottom if the ropes or the cable snaps. And so most of the elevators today in the 2000s you will see may say Otis on it. Otis is a big elevator company. Mass transit used to be run by coal, so it was dirty and messy in the streets, but now it's run on clean electricity, and we can carry large amounts of people around the city. There's electric streetcars run on overhead cables, underground subways to keep people off the streets, but they travel underground. And richer people take commuter trains into the cities because they have money to move out into the outskirts, which are cleaner and quieter, and these are called the suburbs. You live in a suburb. Huntertown and this area is a suburb of the main city of Fort Wayne. City planning becomes a new way to you can get trained in city planning. It's a new service of architectural firms which pop up in the 1850s and 60s. Architecture becomes a real study on how we can make and design different types of buildings, and they pretty much design all of the schools and libraries and public buildings that we see. We also start to zone certain areas of the cities, which means that we designate certain areas for specific purposes. We have residential zoning, industrial zoning, and commercial zoning. So hopefully we don't have a residential area right next to a dirty factory because it wouldn't do well. We need to zone certain parts of the city. And we also zone parts of the city for specific purposes, and parks are a very important aspect for public living and to prevent urban overgrowth. Philadelphia zoned areas along the river as parks so that industries couldn't dump their waste into the river. Frederick Law Olmsted designed Central Park in New York City, amongst many, many other parks, but Central Park still remains a vital part of Manhattan to this day. Urban problems. Well, these poor urban workers are forced to live in these awful houses right next to the factory, which are called tenement housing. They're low-cost, multi-family housing, and several families have to live in one apartment or even one room of an apartment. The rich people who own these tenements don't keep them. There's no laws saying they have to upkeep them or anything, so they do the bare minimum, cram as many people into it as they can in these areas. Also, there's no good ventilation to these tenements. There's few windows in the tenement housing and no sanitation. It is designed to fit as many people into a building as possible. Unpaved streets outside of these places were littered with trash. They share toilets, one toilet for each floor pretty much in the tenement housing, and those were usually clogged and did not work. And even dead horses lay in the street, which I'll show you in the next page, and kids just played around them. You want to play around a dead horse? That sounds fun. Jacob Riis is a journalist who decides to document the living conditions of these poor people in tenement housing, and he publishes his story in Scribner's Magazine, and his book is called How the Other Half Lives. And he describes the tenement housing, he shows pictures of the poor and their conditions, and how the greed of the wealthy causes all these problems. And here you can see the dead horse picture there on the far right, the kids just hanging out around the dead horse. And so here's a sketch of a tenement house floor plan. So crowded housing and the housing so close together allows fires to spread easier. There's a great Chicago fire in 1871 which kills over 200 people and leaves 100,000 people homeless in the city. And after this, cities begin to start to provide fire protection, city fire departments, fire response teams, fire brigades, in order to prevent fires from spreading. Dark streets where people walk, especially at night, led to crime. And so these people have to walk from their factory back home in the dark. Crime can happen to them. So cities start to deploy modern police forces to patrol the streets. Instead of just the one constable, they train multiple police forces to patrol the streets. They help with new electric street lights, and another problem that they have to deal with, the police, are gangs that form in these tenement areas along racial or ethnic lines. And so that's all I have for you today. Make sure you fill out those learning targets, and I'll be sure to see you back here tomorrow. Bring you all your questions. Bye-bye.